Before we get into this spooky video, I just wanted to let you know to subscribe, like, and comment. Now let's get right into the video. Number 5. What I heard when I pressed pause. I was taking the bus home late at night. It's always empty and full of crazies, but I got used to it. I usually just sat down and put my headphones on and listened to music until I got home. One night, a man sat next to me, which I thought was strange, since there were many open seats where he could sit by himself. But again, the bus at that time was usually full of strange people. I ignored him and focused my attention out the window. Eventually, I became aware that this man was mumbling something to himself. I discreetly paused my music and tried to make out what he was saying. It turns out I'd been sitting there quietly for a good 15 minutes while this man sat next to me talking to himself about how he should stab this woman and show her what he can do. I was terrified, but I felt like I couldn't move or alert him in any way. I didn't know if he would get angry or aggressive if I tried to get up, so I was forced to sit there quietly listening to him until 10 minutes later when he finally got up and got off the bus. Number 4. She didn't tell me someone died there. One summer during college, I took a job as a counselor at a Girl Scout camp. I was in charge of a cabin full of girls that would change from week to week as new campers came in. But I stayed in the same cabin all summer. As time went on, I noticed weird stuff happening. Girls complained of nightmares, which I thought was normal, except that all the girls seemed to be having the same nightmares. They all talked of a mean old man who had a scar on his face and chased him through the camp up to the cabin where they locked themselves inside while he banged on the doors and windows. There were other strange things too. Returning to the cabin to discover the lights on while we'd all make sure it was off before we left as a group for dinner or an evening activity. Meals were mandatory and activities were camp-wide. No one should have been off on their own to turn the lights on once we'd left the cabin for the evening. I also noticed that any food or water bottles I had in the cabin tended to disappear. At first, I blamed the girls because they weren't allowed to have food of their own, so I thought maybe they were looking through my bags to steal the candy bars I stored there, just for a little pick-me-up. But again, like with the lights, there just wasn't any reasonable time in which anyone would be alone long enough in the cabin for them to go through my bag unnoticed. At the end of the summer, the girls had gone home, and the staff spent a tiring weekend packing the camp up and cleaning everything from top to bottom. On our last night, we were having a big bonfire and socializing, and generally having a great time saying goodbye to each other. As I was getting ready to return to my cabin for one last night of sleep, the cabin director came up to me and asked in a kind of strange way how the summer had been. I told her the campers were exhausting at times, but that I really enjoyed the work and I hoped to be back next summer. She cried a bit more, and eventually I realized she was asking if I'd noticed anything strange about the cabin. It turns out that while the camp was closed up for the winter, a homeless man had broken into this particular cabin and evidently spent a few weeks there before the owner of the camp discovered his body at the beginning of spring. The camp director even came with me back to the cabin where she pulled one of the bunk beds away from the wall and showed me a number of lines that had been carved into the wall, tallies they thought meant he was tracking each day that passed. I did go back to that job the following summer, but on a condition I was assigned a different cabin. Number 3. The people in my house. As I was pulling my car into the driveway late one night, my headlights illuminated 2 people in my living room. I owned my home and lived alone. I immediately put the car in reverse and called the cops. I waited for them to get in the driveway before I returned. I sat out there while they searched the whole house, and they couldn't find any trace of anyone breaking in or even being in my house. When I went inside, I saw nothing was out of place. I convinced myself that it had been a long week at work, and my mind was playing tricks on me. Maybe it was a weird reflection from my lights in the window. That is, until I talked to a neighbor a few days later, and he told me he saw a couple going into my house the evening in question. He thought I knew them because they seemed to have a key. Number 2, I was his friend. In high school, there was a home on my block that was constantly between occupants. For whatever reason, it just changed hands a lot. We joked that perhaps the house was haunted, but my high school self wasn't worried about that at all. I used to sneak in through an unlocked basement window and hang out there alone and veg out when I needed space. Frequently, I'd be there alone for a few hours listening to music on my headphones. One Saturday afternoon, I was hanging at the empty house listening to music and staring off into space. I was laying on my back and didn't notice anything weird happening. That's the afternoon I realized I wasn't the only one who liked to hang out at that empty house. When I packed up my stuff a few hours later and went down into the basement to leave via the window, I passed by the door to the room I'd been hanging out in. Someone had etched into the back of the door a crude drawing. It wasn't well done, but even with my adrenaline going, I could tell it was supposed to be a sketch of me laying on the floor, my headphones wrapped around my bed. Underneath it, scratched into the door, was the word friend. Number 1, a bad feeling. In 2002, I moved to Los Angeles, and I was living in my first apartment alone. I didn't have a lot of money, and my neighborhood wasn't that great, but it seemed safe enough, and I was excited to live in a place alone, so I figured I could handle myself. One morning, I got ready for work, grabbed my bag, and went to head out the door, but the door would not open. At first, I thought I'd forgotten the lock was turned, so I double-checked it a few times, but the door was totally stuck. I freaked out, suddenly claustrophobic in the small space, and annoyed that I was going to be late for work. I picked up the phone to call my landlord when I heard gunshots outside. I ran to the door and pulled it open smoothly. I thought better of it and shut and locked it again, waiting for the police to come before I opened it again. Later that day, I found out there had been a shooting directly in front of my building at exactly the time I would have been walking out the door. I wasn't the intended target, obviously, but I think someone was watching out for me, making sure I wouldn't get caught up in someone else's violence. Shout out to my main channel, Mr. Splashman, and I'll see you later. Peace.